Well, good morning to you all, and thank you for inviting CAF to participate in this very interesting conference. I don't know how well CAF is known in Canning House, so I will first give a brief overview of what we do, then an overview of the situation of infrastructure from our perspective in Latin America, and our own role, what we are doing in that area. First of all, who we are. Although the origins of CAF are in the 5 Andean countries, we are now really a development bank of Latin America, and I emphasize the of because the difference with many other development banks on a worldwide basis is that we are 95% owned by developing countries of Latin America, the only exceptions being Spain and Portugal for obvious cultural and historical reasons. So basically, this is the only development bank, regional development bank in the world that is essentially owned by their own countries, by the Latin American countries in this case. And this gives us a difference and a sense of ownership that is perhaps not so common in other organizations. Our mission is to promote sustainable development and regional integration in the region, and we do that by mobilizing financial resources from international capital markets towards Latin America, and we provide a multiplicity of banking and non-banking services to our member countries. Our principal members are still the original founding members, the 5 original Andean members, that is from north to south, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. But we now have 10 full members, which include the 4 Mercosur members, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, as well as Panama, and 6 other Latin American members of a different asset class, as well as Spain and Portugal, which I mentioned earlier. As I said, our mission is to promote sustainable development and regional integration. I won't go into detail on this graph, but basically our vision of sustainable development is to promote sustained and quality growth in Latin America, and by quality we mean inclusive growth, employment generating growth, and obviously for these, to achieve these things, these objectives, we postulate the 4 basic principles of that growth should include or should aim for social equity, environmental sustainability, of course, macroeconomic stability as a necessary, although not sufficient, condition for sustained growth. And that was perhaps our mistakes in the 90s with the so-called Washington Consensus, as well as microeconomic efficiency to be more productive, to be more competitively inserted into international economies, and to be more socially inclusive over time. As regards regional integration, we view integration in a very broad sense. There are very many facets to integration. We are very strong in what we call physical infrastructure integration in the region. I will mention that a little bit later. But we also work on economic, commercial, financial, energy, social and cultural integration, as well as in regulatory and logistical coordination and environmental issues that cut across individual countries in the region. How we view our roles as a development bank is basically we have 2 broad kinds of roles. Obviously the financial role is the first one, and we play, as I say, a catalytic role by intermediating resources from the international capital markets and through co-financing mechanisms with both other multilateral banks as well as the private sector commercial banks on a worldwide scale. We play a very significant counter-cyclical role in development finance. Enrique, my boss, the president of CAF, likes to use the analogy of the fellow who gives you an umbrella when it's when the sun is shining, but when you need an umbrella when it's really raining, you don't necessarily find one. That is, bankers, we tend to play a counter-cyclical role, that is providing the umbrella when we have a very stormy day. And this is what we did during 2008, 2009. We played a very strong counter-cyclical financial role, providing contingent financing, short-term financing for the banking system in Latin America, contingent financing for our countries who had difficulties in accessing capital markets at the time, etc. We try to compensate for market weaknesses when feasible. That basically means assuming risks that cannot be efficiently taken by the private sector, or at least facilitating mechanisms, including through public-private partnerships, as joint ventures are now called, that will enhance the mechanisms for these public-private partnerships to work. We also have a series of non-financial roles, which we summarize in the idea of developing specialized knowledge and expertise through a comprehensive approach to studying and researching development issues in the region. We use the resources, the intellectual resources of the region. We have a small, strong economist and analytical base, but we basically use the intellectual resources of the region to go deeper into many of these policy issues, to develop a strong knowledge of the region and sectors in Latin America, and we try to use that to promote best practices and policies. We try to be efficient and to reinvent ourselves continuously as our environment, our milieu changes, and in Latin America it evolves very quickly and very surprisingly. We heard the first presenter this morning say that he believes that rating agencies will be upgrading many of Latin America's economies to higher levels of credit risk ratings, and that has significant implications for CAF. Mostly positive, but also creates challenges for the way we manage our own activities. We have been growing very strongly in the last 20 years, really, but these graphs show the last 5 years. Our portfolio has been growing at an average of about 12% per year, I think, the last 5 years. We will be closing this year's our shareholders' equity at over $6 billion, and our total portfolio will close at over $15 billion at the end of this year. We have become, since this is an infrastructure discussion, we have become the principal source of multilateral finance for infrastructure in Latin America. This graph shows the first decade of this century, where CAF approved about $24 billion in infrastructure, a bit more than the IDB, and substantially more than the World Bank in the same period. The same applies for energy financing. We have become the principal source of multilateral energy financing in the region, and we heard a previous speaker talk about the energy situation in the region, and certainly the energy sector is one of the largest demander of financial resources anywhere in the world. Our estimates in CAF for the energy sector in Latin America are somewhere between 70 and $90 billion per year of investment that are required, both in the oil and gas sectors as well as in the power sectors and in renewable sectors. Overall, we have become a growing source of overall multilateral finance in Latin America. And if we look at the bottom part of this chart, our approvals in the last 10 years have totaled 35% of total multilateral approvals, including the IDB and the World Bank, as well as CAF. So basically, multilateral financing in Latin America is now a three-way pie, if you wish, shared between CAF, IDB, and the World Bank. And the perspective is for that to remain like that in the next few years. Let me turn now a little bit to infrastructure. I think we all know what the importance of infrastructure is for development, but it is all the more important for a developing or an emerging country than it is for a very well-developed country such as Great Britain. As it improves the quality of life, obviously promotes social inclusion, which is a very critical issue in Latin America. As you know, something like 30 or 40% of our population lives in what we could call generically shanty towns or something to that effect. And obviously, much of our underdevelopment is concentrated territorially in these underdeveloped urban areas. Therefore, to the degree that we can get good quality infrastructure into these areas, development, convert them into real urbanized parts, integrate them and include them into the urbanized parts of our countries, we will be doing very much for development. Obviously, it generates opportunities for isolated locations. Our countries are fairly large and generally underpopulated, with large areas of Latin America being isolated. Therefore, things like communications technology, obviously roads, access, electricity are very important for isolated locations. The investment in infrastructure supports growth and development. In general, our thinking is that investment as a proportion of GDP is lower than it should be in Latin America to be able to attain growth rates, overall GDP growth rates of the order of 6–7% per year, which is what we are aiming for. We would probably need investment levels of somewhere between 28% and 30% of GDP. We're substantially below that. We're closer to 22–23% overall. So therefore, there's a lot of room for improvement in investment in general and in infrastructure investment in particular, in order to support industrial development, the increase in the supply of goods and services, and of course to promote competitiveness. Just to use an example, in The Economist edition of a couple of weeks ago, there was an important section on the emerging world, I think it was. And when they discussed Brazil, they talked about what the Brazilians call the Brazil cost. And basically, the Brazil cost is, to a great extent, the difficulties of infrastructure that make it more expensive and more difficult to be competitive in the world economy with many of their very, very good quality products. So investment in infrastructure can translate into increased competitiveness in the international markets. And of course, infrastructure also promotes regional integration as well as internal national integration, and helps to support decentralization processes where these are in process. As an example, CAF is very strong in financing, has been very strong in the last 20 years or so, financing the road development in Bolivia. Bolivia is a fairly large country, about 1.2 or 1.3 million square kilometers in the heart of South America. And it's basically a hinge, or could be a hinge, between north and south and east and west movements of goods and services and people across South America. And basically the road system in Bolivia was very underdeveloped, and with CAF's help and the Bolivian government's help over the years, we have been very substantially significant in changing the situation of Bolivia's road development and regional integration with Argentina, with Brazil, with Paraguay, with Peru, and even with Chile. Latin America is falling behind in infrastructure, however. The quality of infrastructure is generally unsatisfactory, although there are differences across sectors. Even though we heard this morning, and it's correct, that many countries are having difficulties with electricity, generation, etc. In general, we feel that the electrical sector, the power sector in general, is one of the more acceptable ones as far as infrastructure goes. There are improvements to be made, of course, and some countries, such as Venezuela, are having more difficulties than others, but in general, although there's much investment to be made, it is reasonably in good shape across the region, as well as telecommunications. We are less well developed in port and infrastructure and airport infrastructure. There are a lot of bottlenecks here, many problems that are not only related to infrastructure, but also related to regulatory aspects, to processes involving import and exports that also introduce restrictions and costs in competitive insertion into the international markets. And we are quite deficient in transportation, water and sewerage, as well as information technology connectivity. The costs of broadband connectivity in Latin America are very high in comparison with the developed world, and this certainly doesn't help the process of of competitiveness and the process of inclusion and the process of development in general. So we're very much aware of these limitations and trying to compensate for that in our own infrastructure programs. For example, when we finance road buildings in Colombia or in Ecuador or wherever, or electricity lines, we try to include or convince the owners of these projects, the governments, or whether they be governments or private sectors, to try and include connectivity, technology connectivity, information technology, that is fiber, optical fiber, etc., so that in the future, the development of say, traditional infrastructure will also bring with it the technological connectivity that we require to bring down costs to increase supplies. We've heard, and we certainly agree with that, that Latin America is poised to advance very significantly in the development process in the next few years, the few decades. We certainly have a ways to go, even in comparison with the newly industrialized countries of Asia. We are way below in per capita income, and we have a much worse income distribution than they do. So just to try and close the gap with the Koreas of this world gives us an enormous opportunity. And as we've heard today, as policies, economic policies in general in Latin America have become more pragmatic, some of these gaps are being closed more quickly than others in some countries, although obviously there's much ground to be covered as we go along. Also, if there's one very clear message, and we also heard that this morning, is that inclusion, social equity, reduction of social inequities, reduction of poverty, all those things have to be the main focus of our economic policies. That is why CAF's agenda for development includes not only macro stability and microeconomic efficiency, which is, if you wish, the traditional agenda, but also environmental sustainability and social inclusion. Because we have come to realize, and I think there are many examples in the region, that without an appropriate focus on the social dimensions of development from all aspects, the sustainability is not there. Political sustainability will not be there in the long run. So we are very clear on this, and we feel that even infrastructure has to be focused on social development as well. And just to give you an example, we try to accompany our infrastructure projects when we finance, again, a road or a power line or a gas pipeline in the region. We try to include, in one way or another, the communities that are often located along these areas to try and generate some improvement for their conditions of life, so that they feel that they form part of this development process. And it's very important to take that into account. Some of our challenges in infrastructure, I already mentioned. We need to invest more and invest better quality in Latin America. We are investing approximately 2.5% of GDP in infrastructure. Best practices suggest that we should be doing something like 6% of GDP. And also the fact that the increases that are required in investments cannot be undertaken exclusively by the public sector, but will also require private participation in an increasing manner. And in many countries, this is being done in Latin America. Not in all of them, of course, but this is improving. We need to have the public sector increase the levels of public investment as well, and also quality and efficiency, allocating more resources for maintenance. We in CAF, we finance a lot of roads in some countries, and we insist on the institutional development for the maintenance of these roads so that the investment is not lost, given our tropical climates are very strong rains, etc., and very fertile rainforests that can easily destroy a road if maintenance is not maintained, for example. We are trying to improve focuses on subsidies, trading off additional investment, say in a better quality road versus long-term maintenance costs. and trying to contribute to ensuring a better quality regulatory framework. As I said, public investment is not necessary, but private investment in infrastructure needs to increase. We are participating in that as CAF, encouraging foreign direct investment, public-private partnerships that aim at distributing the risks between governments and the private sector. And there, CAF can play a role, as I said earlier, covering some market weaknesses that sometimes make it difficult to achieve these public-private partnerships in a practical way. We're encouraging new sources of financing, local financing, stock markets, pension funds, infrastructure funds. These are all mechanisms that can contribute to the development of infrastructure investments. As I mentioned, we're working also in regulatory frameworks when it is possible to mitigate the risks of private investments in infrastructure projects. And there is substantial progress in some countries, Colombia, Peru, obviously Chile, where we're not very active, to a lesser extent Uruguay, are all countries that are increasingly using private investment for public infrastructure services. And CAF is involved in many of these types of initiatives. Some more specific challenges. Transportation continues to be a very important challenge in the region, both in roads, ports, airports, and mass transportation. CAF is involved in all of them. We are strong also in urban transportation, in train development, metros and the like, and as well as massive or rapid transit bus systems in Colombia, in Ecuador. We're working on that in Peru as well. So there's a lot of expertise in CAF for some of these things, always aiming at mitigating the negative externalities involved in the difficulties in the mobility of people within our region. The power sector, the objective is to ensure the required expansion requirements while balancing planning, regulatory issues, and market forces in a sustainable manner. We aim at promoting the development of renewable energy resources, promote universal access to power sources throughout the region, and good quality service, and there's certainly room for improvement there. In communications and information technology, mobile telephone networks have done very well in Latin America in general, and I think over 90% of the population probably has access to these services. This has to continue. Where we are weak, as I mentioned earlier, is in the question of broadband internet connectivity, especially within Latin America, and the cost associated with that. And obviously, potable water, sewerage, the need to guarantee universal access to these services and improve efficiencies. There's much to be done in those sectors. Some specific areas are, and I won't repeat myself here, ensure financing needs for infrastructure development, and there's much to be said again for public-private partnerships. Improve institutions and policies related to infrastructure. We need good planning, regulatory, and oversee capacity in infrastructure investments, both public and private, and a good coordination processes between the public and private sectors. And obviously, and this is very significant, very important for CAF, and we certainly included in all our activities, is to assign an increasing importance to environmental and social issues in decisions related to infrastructure. Just a very recent example are the difficulties the government of Bolivia has had recently with a road that aimed at, was not financed by CAF, by the way, fortunately, aimed at traversing a regional forestry reserve, if you wish, or a natural reserve, which was very important for certain parts of the indigenous populations of Bolivia. Well, there were inadequate consultations, inadequate environmental and social impact analysis for this road, and the result has been that the Bolivian government has had to backtrack on that road and has suspended the construction, and they will probably have to go around that natural reserve. That is the importance of environmental and social issues related to infrastructure. We heard of the issue in energy is very important in Peru. There are objections from indigenous populations to mining developments, etc. So if we do not take these social issues and environmental issues into account, the sustainability of these investments can be called into question. Finally, the role of CAF in infrastructure in the region. Our portfolio last year, at the end of last year, was about $13.9 billion. We will close at over $15 billion this year, and I think the infrastructure share will even be greater than 54%. I think we'll be probably closer to 60% this year. And that really underestimates our total infrastructure because a good part of the social sector investment includes water development infrastructure. So actually, I would say that our total infrastructure portfolio in CAF is probably closer to 70% than to 50%. So we have been very strong in infrastructure over the years. As I said, we are the #1 multilateral source of financing for infrastructure in the region. And what do we do there? We basically work with transportation systems, informations and communications technology systems, energy, and water systems. Those are the main areas. And obviously within transportation, we have mass transit as well as road development. In energy, we work both with the power sector, mostly with the power sector, but also increasingly with the oil and gas sector. What do? We finance both public, private, and joint ventures in these sectors through long-term loans, guarantees, project and structured financing services, pre-feasibility studies, financial advisory services, depending on the type and the nature of the operation that is being proposed to CAF. We have, as I said, a strong focus on social and environmental sustainability. We do research on the infrastructure sector, both on a national and regional scales. When I say research, we promote studies, we use our own resources and catalyze resources from the region and the world to do this. We are strong in financing infrastructure for Latin American integration. We'll see a map in a moment. South America in particular is a very large continent and very, very disconnected. It's very difficult to talk about integration, economic or otherwise, if we do not have connectivity amongst us. And CAF has been at the forefront of financing infrastructure for integration. And we generate knowledge, as I say, and provide advice to governments that request it on public policies, institutional strengthening, and management of infrastructure. Some areas of applied research include regional integration through what is called the Regional Initiative for Integrating Infrastructure in South America. That's the IRSA at the beginning. We have an urban mobility observatory. We are building up databases on mobility in the main cities of Latin America with a view to developing expertise and provide a stronger consultancy on urban transportation. We have developed Geosur, which is a satellite-based information network with the U.S. Geological Survey support on a technical basis, which allows us to view the whole continent from a geospatial point of view. And this is a very useful planning tool for development of infrastructure, among other things. For example, we are studying the small hydro potential of the state of Sao Paulo using this tool to identify potential locations, since the satellite imagery is very precise for these purposes. We have a sustainable energy program where we promote renewable power generation, hydrothermal, solar, wind energies. Many of these projects are small, by small being less than $40 or $30 million, $50 million projects that are really project finance, but they're too small to be, it's too costly to approach them from a traditional project finance focus. Therefore, we have developed a process that allows us to do the project financing on a smaller scale and on a competitive basis. And we're working on that. That is called the Propel system. We have a program for improving the quality of ports and airports, development of border areas, and I've mentioned several times the technology area. I think I'll pass this. As I said, we have played a very significant role in the physical integration of infrastructure in Latin America. We have financed in more or less the past decade, directly financed, approved $7.3 billion to 57 projects in physical integration in the region. Some of them are sort of shown there. I'll just point one out, is the Bolivia-Brazil gas pipeline. It's a very important project in which we participated in the late 90s. But there are many, many others. The total investments involved in these projects amount to close to $30 billion. And this regional integration process has been developed through this IRSA initiative, which began in 2000 and which is now being absorbed by UNASUR, the new South American integration mechanism, through which the CAF, IDB, and FONPLATA, together with the 12 countries of South America, have tried to develop a strategic vision for the physical integration of the region. We have identified these integration and development hubs, which are basically graphed here, with a view to identify projects within those hubs that will increase connectivity across the region. I'll give you an example. CAF, as well as the IDB, and if I'm correct, I think the European Community, have financed a very important road that goes from Puerto Cruz, from Santa Cruz in Bolivia, to the border with Brazil in Corumbá. And this road, once it is finished, and I think the European component is the one that's missing, will finally connect, fully connect, east-west, the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans through South America. We have also financed a very important, what we call the Transoceanic Road in southern Peru, that connects southern Peru with the border of Brazil. And again, this will also serve as an east-west connector between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And that is the philosophy behind these integration and development hubs that have been identified, that include not only road, but also power, telecommunications, etc. projects. What are the main priorities in Latin America as we see them now? Basically, water supply with all the social implications that it has, including sewerage and treatment with all of the environmental implications that it has. I think something like 90% of used water is returned untreated to the bodies of water in Latin America. Obviously, this is an enormous challenge for the region. We continue to support and improve urban transportation systems. We think this is very critical, especially as Latin America's population, which is already highly urbanized, becomes increasingly so, and very densely populated cities. Improve road maintenance and the quality of the institutions that are in charge of building and maintaining infrastructure, road infrastructure. Road security has now become a very significant issue worldwide. I think the United Nations has adopted I don't know if the word is road security, but it's something to that effect, the decade of road security. This is a very, very significant problem in Latin America, in Asia, in the world in general, as motorcycles particularly become more prevalent as a means of transportation in many of our very traffic-clogged cities. There are increasing accidents and deaths as a result of this problem, and this has become really a very important worldwide public issue. I've mentioned several times the expansion of broadband connectivity throughout Latin America, regional integration, and always maintain the strong focus on environmental issues. Just to finalize, CAF is involved in many of these initiatives, and we expect to continue to be involved over the years. We are now 41 years old, going on 42, and we expect to be there for the next 40 years or so, at least, doing much of these things that are necessary for Latin America. Thank you for your attention.